Welcome everyone to a special roundtable discussion here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. We're going to be doing a topic and seeing this turns into a future series, talking about strategy game design as well as AI design in video games. It's a topic that has definitely been of interest for a lot of developers, and it's definitely something I think kind of flies over the head of a lot of consumers, especially people in today's market who focus more on PvP design. So we have a somewhat different roundtable for tonight. So we'll go in order from Theresa, Seth, and Tomo in terms of introduction. So Theresa, go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Theresa Duringer, and I'm the owner and CEO of Temple Gates Games. We are a small board game app development company based out of San Francisco, and we have a number of board games that we've come up with. We're digitizing board games, and we work with publishers of the physical products. So we are right now working on Dominion, which is in a beta. You can check out templegatesgames.com/beta if you want to join in on that. We did Race for the Galaxy, Roll for the Galaxy, Ascension, which we did in VR, and we also did the sequel to Ascension on mobile, which is Shards of Infinity.
All right, and down to Seth.
Hey, I'm Seth Goldberg. I'm a former game developer working in AAA and owning my own game development company. Currently, I'm working on a project called the Strategy Informer, where I promote, review, curate, aid in discovery of strategy games of all types. And I'm also doing some development for various companies in various roles from a contract level. So, yeah. 13, I started wargaming when I was 13, so I've been doing the strategy thing for a while.
Next. And Tomma.
Actually, what Seth there made me realize maybe I should talk a little bit about my lifelong passion for war games. But yeah, my name is Tomo Moriwaki. I am the sort of design director for Hyperkinetic Studios. I've been a game designer for 25 years. At least that's what I'm saying. I might be off by 1 year, plus or minus. It's totally possible. Claim to fame being the creative director of Spider-Man 2 in 2004. And we're working on a game that, in a way, in a manner of speaking, uses AI, Epic Tavern, to sort of construct procedural stories. And yeah, I've been a lifelong, nearly fanatically interested sort of military historian and war game player, ranging from squad leader back in the day through all the conventions of Axis and Allies and even chess, etc., etc., and plenty of video games ranging from Tanks Exclamation Point through Steel Panthers through to games like War in the East. I'm no stranger to any scale of strategy gaming.
One day, Tomo, we got to sit down, me and you. Mono.
All right. And for myself, I am, of course, from Game Wisdom, and I write and talk about game design and the industry. And I can tell you that I am the least programmer, or the non-programmer of our group today. So I'm going to leave it to you three to talk a lot about the designs here. But
am I second least? Possibly.
But AI design, especially in strategy games, is a very interesting topic when it comes to kind of developing, I guess, what kind of mood do you want the game to be about? Because we've seen games where, the complexity of the AI can greatly affect how somebody's going to play and experience this title. A really good example of this will, of course, be Firaxis' take on XCOM, and how the lower the difficulty, the more kind of, I guess, mulligans you give the player. On the highest difficulty, that AI will rock you. Some of it is just by the AI doing plans, and some of it is by designing the game around the limitations of the AI. And I'm sure we're going to talk, I'm sure the three of you have a whole lot to say on that very point right there. So, I guess to get things rolling, for the three of you, what are your thoughts on, in terms of the complexity of what an AI should be in a game, as in, like, should developers be looking at, the Matrix Skynet of trying to create an AI that's going to destroy the player, or is it more about trying to figure out what is the role the AI is going to play in the design or in the play of it? And anyone feel free to chime in.
I think the AIs that are currently around are built to be speed bumps. I'm not sure on the turn-based side, when you're looking at the newer ones like Humankind, Civ 6, they've really deviated from where an AI is producing a challenge to you. And I think the role of an AI is to indeed challenge the player and scale up as the player gets better, to provide a constant challenge. It'd be great if the AI could be tuned to win 40, 50% of the games at whatever level it was set at. I think that we might be in the exception here, thinking that the players want to be actually challenged. I did a unofficial poll, found out that like 32% of 100 people said that they didn't want a challenge. Brad Wardell of Stardock said for Gal Civ 2, some ridiculous number percentage-wise, not 50%, but a little lower than that, didn't bring the AI above easy.
I think that's a very interesting point. Like, I think for like different player mindsets is also a factor. Like, for me, when I typically play video games, I will play it on hard, either the hardest or second hardest for most video games, because I like that challenge. However, I've also learned that in games that are very much like abstracted, like RPGs, never to play those games on the highest difficulties, just because it's more about kind of the stat imbalance rather than the game. And with like your example or your idea of it being more like a roadblock, we can look at Civilization as a really good example. That in the Civ games, the AI gets complicated only to a point, and then becomes more about giving more advantages. The AI can produce units twice as fast. They can see what the player is doing. There's that sense that the AI is not playing the same game as the player. And it also raises that question, if the AI could literally be designed that it plays almost like a grandmaster at this game, would people be interested in doing that? Would someone want to play against AI that is just going to be like playing against someone who's, the top 10 players in the world at this game?
I'd love to see that personally. I mean, that's why I play games, to be challenged. And if I'm playing a single player style board game, I want to feel like I'm playing against a human opponent. Civ 5, and I'm going to pass this one to Tomo in a second. I'm just going to bring it up. Civ 5 had a really nice AI that acted human.
Is that the Passover?
That's the best.
Well, I just want to say, I think calling it a speed bump is a descriptor, but I think that really what we're seeing in a lot of games nowadays, I got to get away from this extremely bright light, is I think an improvement or an evolution of AI to see the single player experience as still guiding the player appropriately through understanding and learning the systems and enjoying that exploration. And that we are in the minority. And I think if you find players from back in the day, you couldn't be a player that wasn't into overcoming obstacles, because that's what the games were. But I think we've evolved to a point. The industry more than understands that we're really selling engaging experience, and I feel like the strategy games that have really understood that are the ones that get to play in today's arena, and those that don't they're sort of barred from entry. There is still the on the periphery of the larger games industry, a lot of the classic strategy games are still out there. They're just They just have small user bases because they have to be people like us that were users back then, because their language doesn't make sense to the users of today. And with respect to Civ 5, though, Civ 5 is great. It's just, it feels really good, and I feel like they really understood difficulty as well as accommodating, kind of making it an interesting experience as well. And I don't know.
I was going to respond to Tomo's point about the minority aspect of players. Like, something we see as a studio is we find that, your player base is not homogenous, and of course there's going to be people who want the like super challenging and people who want the like more accessible level. But there's a total vocal minority on the challenging side. You have tournament players, you have your top tier super competitive players, and they're all gunning for the like most like extreme challenge because that's where they're putting all their time and energy and they're interested in it. But that is not the like majority of your player base. And so I think there's a trap of falling into like servicing those players because they're so vocal, they're so active on your forums, at the kind of expense of like what the majority of your players are looking for, which is a little bit more of a moderated challenge. So I think it's, from the design developer perspective, we just have to try to find a balance. And we don't offer something like a human AI. That is something that you can get worth more of a scripted AI, but we do use this neural network, which delivers something that's absolutely optimized to win and not necessarily to optimize to play like a human being. And there are a lot of costs to that. Some people might want to feel like they're playing a human. In fact, we get a lot of emails from people who swear that our AI cheats. And they think it knows more information, then that's not fair. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't, but it feels like it's not playing like a human, and that can be sometimes not the perfect experience. But there's trade-offs, so there's reasons that we do it.
Yeah, and I think what you just said there, Theresa, is a good point about the actual player base for this challenge, because it's a trap that we see, as you said, a lot of developers will fall into, that they'll listen to the 5% or the 10% who say, I want this game to be as hard as possible, and instant permadeath, and your saves get erased. But how many people actually want to play that is a different story. Like the La Mulana series, for anyone who hasn't heard that, it's basically 2D Dark Souls. It is incredibly challenging, very punishing to play. If you learn it, it's probably one of the most engrossing Metroidvania 2D action-adventure games on the market. But it is so explicitly designed to be difficult to play. And, right away that it's one of those games where you're going to die, and it's just never going to be your fault. Like, it's just the game saying, okay, we didn't tell you about this, you're dead. And there are people who love that game. There is a very rabid fan base, and they have gone after me because I made a negative review about it. But, again, it raises that question of, if this game was a little bit easier, if it was a little bit more accommodating, or there were difficulty settings, or any measure of approachability, will there be more people playing that game? And it's a question that I think the answer is yes. But without somebody actually making, La Mulana approachable, most people will just say, no, it's never going to work like that. It's the same thing about, Dark Souls is perfect and there's never any problems with it. Which I know at Tomo, we had our discussion about difficulty design on that very topic.
Yeah, well, I think, it's sort of a related topic, is how harshly rules are enforced in an experience for a player. The kinds of games where a mistake is punished seriously is a kind of game that feels hard. But if you take Dark Souls as an example, actually, it's that once you know the pattern, aside from your ability to kind of manage timings, which is like a dynamic physical skill, and you might be terrible at it, and so you might have to practice a lot. But in a turn-based environment, it would simply be hit A, not B, after you've learned that pattern. And in that regard, then, once you understand, it's trivial. That in a kind of competitive perspective, though, now you have to create enough complexity that someone could out know the rule set than you, and now you're in a tricky place. And obviously, a strong, like kind of a naked AI that understands the rules perfectly would be overwhelmingly difficult in that kind of a circumstance. And yeah, we get it. People don't want that. So then, for that kind of environment, you have to build in error, or you don't let the computer know the rules and you teach it with a neural network.
A lot of games, strategy games right now, Stellaris, the AI has no idea how to run an economy. It doesn't know the rules. Humankind, I mentioned, the AI just doesn't know the rules properly. So a tight design with maybe less frills could rope in the AI's ability to understand the rules. Stellaris is a horribly complex, a wonderfully complex game. But if it's just a power fantasy, I don't get enjoyment out of it. Now, if they scaled that back and taught the AI how to properly do things, then I think that would be a much better game. But the question that, the thing that Tomo mentioned is, are we the aging dinosaurs that want that style of game?
Yeah, and
I'm amazed at Dominion with the amount of cards that are in it can still compete at the level it does and still play the level it does.
Well, we get around that because, like was mentioned, if you have a neural network, you don't have to teach the AI. You don't have to hand script all these rules, which is fine for a simple game. But the larger the game and the more expansions that come out and the more cards, if you're hand scripting everything, you're going to get a really big inflexible, fragile code base that, is brambly to debug and doesn't really want to accommodate new patches or new game rules or new expansions that might change the balance, because then you have to gut all of this code that you've already written. So I feel like, a bigger game that has a hand scripted AI is going to usually just start getting less competent. The AI will get less competent as the game gets more and more content and grows over the years. But if you do use a neural network, like what we've done, with Dominion, we've done something super special, which is we have integrated the techniques behind Alpha Zero for the first time in a commercial product, which is our way of handling those 500, 600 cards in Dominion now that it's got 14 expansions. We, instead of representing each card as an input node, which we would have done on our previous games, we break the cards into their constituent components and have an embedding layer in the neural network. And that embedding layer is how the AI can understand, let's say there's we would have had to have thousands of input nodes, and now we can have basically 10, because it's what's the card's cost? Did it give you a victory point? Does it draw new cards? Each card is a little recipe of those things. And the really cool thing about that is that, theoretically, the AI, now that we've trained it with this embedding layer, could be a master at a card that has never been designed yet. Let's say Donald invents a new card and it comes out in an upcoming expansion. You could just take that card, add it to the game, and the AI is already trained. It might need to get a little bit retrained to understand the balance of how many of that card are now in the deck, but you don't even need to add any more input nodes. So in that way, it scales absolutely beautifully, and I'm hoping that we've done something kind of new. It accommodates a really big game. I'm hoping to see more of that.
Hey, do you feel like by tracking user behavior, you could figure out how much the AI is training the existing players to employ novel strategies that would have otherwise been practically impossible to discover?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could. I mean, we're seeing that even just on our team. We have
Awesome.
debugging tools, so we can see, in real time as we're playing, what the AI is valuing for a move. But usually a move is like buying a card. So we can just display on screen in real time as we're playing. This card AI is valuing it at 78% chance of winning if it buys it. We change our game. I used to think certain cards were not very good, and now I'm like, well, the AI is scoring that card really high. So either there's a bug, or the game's not balanced, or I don't understand, which is usually the case, why that card was so valuable. But certainly, the neural network that we're using is based on technology. Keldon designed it based on TD Gammon by Gerald Tesoro, and that was an AI for backgammon that totally changed how people play backgammon at tournament levels by discovering new strategies. And so, like, we do know that this has a potential for like influencing player behavior. Like, players are now learning based on things that the AI are discovering, and that's because they're free from, it's the AI is no longer constrained with the neural network to just being as good as the developer is.
So why haven't not AAA, but the larger strategy games not implemented the techniques of AlphaGo or a neural network, or they're still caught in heuristics, it seems.
Right.
I think there's a really good reason for this, by the way. It's that it's not an important vector in the product to improve. That they have a sufficiently large user base that likes what they've done. Like, you take and actually that before they spend money on making the AI better, they probably add more features to add more complexity to the system to explore, because that's kind of their product, right? Their product, Stellaris, is not a product about beating an AI. It's about figuring out how genetic revisions and more SAR systems and balancing your own empire's resources, how the path of exploring how those things create outputs. And the AI is really there just as like it would be weird if there was zero feedback or zero resistance, right? And so until that becomes a problem, they won't spend down that path. At least that's my best guess.
I have a couple theories as well. Don't disagree with that, just add to it. I would say that AAA companies a lot of times have a lot of resources at their disposal. So they're lacking a pressure because they have a bunch of engineers. They have, like, our team is super small. So we have to come up with some crazy new way to, how are we going to come up with an AI that's going to accommodate this huge game? Like, we have to like come up with crazy tools. You could just throw a ton of engineers infinite time and they can keep on updating the heuristic AI forever. And then also, just, I think that the technology is so new that we don't have a way to generalize this AI to all games. There are very specific games this works really well for, like the turn-based strategy games. Board games work really well. Just was it yesterday, very recently, DeepMind just announced that they have a new version of their AI. They've been doing AlphaGo, Alpha Zero. They have a new one that's going to handle hidden information games like poker. So, like, I think the research is also just like super cutting edge, and so I think once it's out there more and people have already, other companies have spent the time and energy to like develop the research, they'll adopt it. Once
you saying that makes me wonder, do you think like big established companies with lots of resources have actually, if we were to imagine that they are like an AI, that they've been trained to be averse to actually solutions that are recursive and outside of their control, like they actually have been trained away from those solutions?
I think there's no way that's not true. That's got to be true. That's
Love
amazing.
It.
The insider scoop on Paradox from some people that worked on a project that got canceled is there's only 2 AI people on the entire team for all the Paradox titles. Now, sometimes the community steps in, and there's a decent AI that was put on top of Stellaris called StarNet that kind of helps out. But still, the base problem of the AI not being able to accommodate causes a problem. There's also with Pandora First Contact, which was kind of a Beyond Earth or Alpha Centauri style game done by Slytherin. A modder came on board and revamped the AI, and they eventually brought that AI into the game. And on their second game, Warhammer Gladius, he built the AI for that, and they actually toned it down from what he built because it was too strong. Now he's working with another guy who's doing a Mu-1 style game, the Precursors, and it's open source, and they're building different AI modules for it. So this is possible. There is a niche here. Gladius was a well-received game. Pandora, not so much. It was really niche.
Well, I mean, it's well received in its circles, right? But I think its total user base is probably a little on the small side. Another thing I'd like to add to exactly what you said there is that, Hearts of Iron, right, has in some ways, once you become an expert at the Hearts of Iron system, it is clear that the AI is unable to do many basic things. And then the community mod comes in to make it, feel better. And I mean, I've done that many a time for these kinds of games. And maybe at some point the developers are also sort of relying on that for that segment of the audience that wants that greater challenge.
Yeah, and like as an example, that was a Supreme Commander 2, that most famously, when it was first released, it got bashed in reviews for the lackluster AI. It was just a very basic one. It didn't really seem like it was playing against the player right. And what happened was a modder, I think Soren, I think that was their name. They created, I think, a neural net AI for Supreme Commander 2, and suddenly that game, like the AI was actually playing against you. And I remember doing a comp stomps, or I should say, the computer was stomping us, where it was reading it like we knew that every time we build something, if we didn't capitalize on it, the AI was going to throw its counter because it knew what we were doing. And then we left it alone too long, then the nukes start dropping. And it's just like, okay, the AI just launched like 8 different nukes at all 3 of our bases. I think we're in trouble. And Age of Empires 2, the Definitive Edition, I know a lot of people have talked about the AI in that. And it does, I think what you said there, Tomo, is very interesting about, is there a actual market for an AI that plays the game like a real person? Or do people prefer, like what Seth said earlier, do they prefer just to be a roadblock, that it is just the appetizer to whatever the main course, which could be, a full-on PvP game? And my phone site to ring, 1 second. And again, like, it's a tough question to answer because, again, like, this panel here, we know strategy games, we know difficult games, like, we like to play these games. But what does again, going back to La Mulana example, is there a market or is there a financial viability to create something that complicated, or just to focus on something smaller? Because as everyone here knows, and for everyone watching this recorded knows, PvP is very much in these days with competitive games, esports, and just the amount of content you can get out of just 2 to 4 players fighting against each other.
I mean, you can get a lot of content out of PvP, but if you can also offer a solo against AI experience, I mean, we see this shift when we launch a game. Everyone plays against AI. 99% of players are against the AI, and it takes a while for that to like shift up to like 25% of the players are in multiplayer now. People want to fail, with an AI. It's more comfortable. I think you don't want to look like an idiot. I think you want to like explore crazy strategies without sinking like an hour of your time into like waiting for a real person to react, if it's a turn-based game. I think there's a lot of reasons why you do a lot of times want to offer the AI multiplayer in addition to like a PvP or multiplayer.
Yeah, as somebody who's just recently tried and failed to play Dead by Daylight, I can certainly attest to that, and the fact that the game has no real offline or, even just half-accurate bot play to try and learn against. It kills any sense of onboarding, because my choices are either don't play the game, or I play against people with hundreds of hours of experience, and it's a waste of my time, and it's a waste of their time, because they're playing against somebody who has 10 to 15 hours, doesn't even know like anything about this game, against their fully kitted strategies, and they've memorized the entire map by now.
I think that's particularly. Oh, I'm sorry.
I wanted to expand a little bit on the metrics of the curve. one thing that I've noticed is that if a game does not have a strong AI, and a PvP mode, if it's a PvP style game and a strong AI, it's not going to have any sort of long tail because the players are going to drop off from the PvP eventually. Just people move on. There's no other games to play. I think a card game these days that doesn't have a good single player mode is like developing for suicide. And we see that with Runeterra. They're putting so much into single player experiences. It keeps a large player base for the PvP, keeps people online. It draws people into the game because they're not intimidated to play against people who have been doing it for 10 years or whatever, 100 hours, and have every card known to mankind. In a board game, I'm not sure what that curve looks like, but I think it would be the same. I can't find a lot of people playing, say, Terraforming Mars at this
point. And go ahead, Theresa. What you were saying earlier.
Oh, I kind of forgot what point I was going to make, but I was going to come back actually to another point that you guys have made about the mods. And I feel like there's this trap as a developer where you feel like you want to deliver everything possible to the players, everything that they could need. You feel a responsibility, I think. And so something I learned when I worked at Maxis, I worked on The Sims and I worked on Spore. And on The Sims, there's a huge modding community, and there's a lot of community activity around distributing content between each other. And we saw that. And on Spore, part of what I worked on is the Sporepedia, which was this browser-based user-generated content exchange kind of marketplace or browser. And it suddenly was like, hey, here's this thing that the mods used to do, and we're going to do it for you. So we spent, Electronic Arts, Maxis money developing this whole thing out. And it was pretty great, but it kind of actually ended up stomping over this thing that a lot of people were building community around, enjoying. And I think in some ways it almost did some amount of disservice if you had just left that up to didn't deliver that. So I'm not saying that developers shouldn't deliver an AI, but in the case where the mods come along and make a way better AI, that seems like a really mutually symbiotic relationship where the modders who have fun with it can do it. And
I kind of agree, but I definitely know I don't know for sure, but it's like every single creative assembly game ever is play against the existing AI just to feel out the systems and then find the realism AI.
And I think to Theresa's point that I guess to kind of throw a question to you, what did you think of when Steam integrated the workshop? Which, for people watching who somehow don't know what that means, the Steam Workshop is just basically Steam's own collection and archival of any kind of mods and elements that users create. And, for the games that support it, which there are quite a bit now on Steam, I can just literally type whatever the heck I want, and most likely, somebody made a mod or a graphical pack or anything for that game. To Tomo's point about a Total War game, the same thing I think a lot of people said about XCOM 2. There are a ton of mods for that game, and many of those are quality of life improvements that I've added to the game.
Some of those guys are really talented. I mean, the XCOM 1 and 2 Long War team have gone off to make their own alien invasion game, Terra Invicta.
Yep, I interviewed Johnny, who's the original guy who came up with that mod, or the
Nice.
Yep, and they did it without any modding tools for XCOM, and that's definitely worthy of some celebration for them.
Well, I mean, the modders are so hardcore. They are more intense game developers than your typical game developer. There was a game I worked on, the first game I worked on, called Die by the Sword in 1997. This is a game that had animation, that had procedural animation of 3D characters. It's a 3D action fighting game set in a fantasy adventure without a single animator on the team. And the only way the animations for attacks for the enemies and what the players could do was all derived off this like 200. It was, there was a file with 256 variables that had things like, left side arc wrist clamp and stuff like that. And still, they figured out, not only did they disassemble the game, they created like a visual interface for making changes to enemy character animations and feeding that back in and writing to files to make that a reality. It was absolutely insane.
That's crazy.
It actually
online. We had people building, bots and stuff to do all the repetitious actions when they were on there, and that's kind of like modding. I mean, I think that was definitely the early days of what modding eventually became.
So I have a very novice question for the chat here, because I know there are a few people like me watching this recorded that probably aren't strong programmers or any programmers whatsoever. So regarding the idea of a neural network AI, what exactly, can you kind of give us the layman's definition of what that is in terms of how that differs from, a traditional AI?
Sure. So traditional AI is going to be a series of logic gates. You're going to say, as a developer, you're going to say, okay, the AI in this scenario should do this. And in this scenario, it should do this. So if this, then that.
Yeah.
And that's what most people do. That basically is just giving a ton of instructions to the AI. Neural network differs in that it's kind of creating a black box where the neural network, you can think of it as a structure, which is basically, this is just representing some math functions, but it's just this little structure where you take these inputs as nodes on one side of the network. Those describe the state of your game. There's a layer of hidden nodes, which is kind of arbitrary number of these. And then the outputs of your network describes the likelihood, in our case, for each player to win the game. So it's this little function that says, here, what's the state of the game and how likely am I to win? So if you have that as a tool, the way it works is, let's say you're playing Race for the Galaxy. It's a role-choosing game. You can plug in your state of the game on a given turn, and you get, we have one neural network that predicts what is your opponent going to do. You take those predictions and you run a simulation of what you can do based on those predictions. So for if you predict the most likely thing is that my opponent is going to settle, then you say, okay, here's a simulation. If the opponent settles, what are all the moves I can make? And then you work through and that ends up being kind of a tree, a branching tree, and you work through to each sort of terminal node on the branch. Sorry, this is getting a little explain like I'm 5, expand like I'm 25, but each terminal node on the tree is a new game state, and you can run these game states through the neural network and say which one's most likely to win. You look at the one where you're most likely to win, and you make the move that resulted in that most likely to move. So it wasn't very clear, but basically it's this little function that kind of just always says, given this game state, what should I do? And the awesome thing about that is that you don't need to teach the neural network anything in advance. It learns, it starts out by making really stupid moves, but it updates as it goes. It always is updating that neural network, the edge weights in between all the nodes, what it updates using a function. And the neural network gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And the more times it plays, the better moves it's making that are more likely to predict a win or more likely to win.
Are you pulling back the data from the players and improving the AI as it goes?
We're not. There's a few reasons not to. One is that it's good enough not doing that, and then it's so much faster to run this, just automate it on the cloud. And so it gets pretty good there, and we don't end up needing to collect that data from our users.
One of the simple ways to describe neural network I like to use is just imagine if you don't know anything about this game, and when you're faced with a move, you have to take out a gigantic phone book like booklet thing, right? And then you look up a few things, and then it tells you, then you pick the one that has the biggest number, and you go, I'm going to do that. The AI knows what it's doing that well, which means not at all in a way, but over the course of time, which that book will get bigger and bigger the more it operates, or if you were to feed it all the player data, it's basically like a sort of like a expression of statistics.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, with poker AI, which we mentioned that they're building an alpha or a deep mind around poker. I mean, I was a semi-pro online player for quite some time, and you just play the numbers. You're literally just playing what is the percentages of expected value. And over time, you'll either gain or lose money based on your expected value and what you're playing. You're not really playing by feeling if someone's bluffing, or you're not even trying to bluff. You're just playing the numbers constantly.
Grinder.
Grinder?
Grinder.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's me. I was a grinder. 12 tables. So, and I think one of the brilliant things about the neural network being applied to AI is that you can make it fuzzy and tone down the difficulty level. So it's not making the optimal move every time.
It may be like the second best or the third best.
Right, exactly.
It reminds.
Well, you could take a whole range, right? You could take a range of the top 20% of solutions, right, and then just have it randomly select amongst them.
It reminds.
Provided the system isn't so simple that that's just one choice.
Yeah. That's something fascinating.
I came up with an interesting idea, and I wanted to throw it by people. If we can't get the civilization AI back to the state it was, where it was producing a challenge, other than the people playing a deity and having the AI have so many advantages, what if we extract out the AI, have it be good enough, speed bumps good enough, whatever, everybody plays on a seed and then competes with everybody else, the entire player base.
Oh, that's a really interesting idea.
So at that point, you're totally extracting the AI and you're playing against other people, kind of.
That's a great like temporal event of sorts.
Am I giving away $1 million ideas again?
Maybe.
at least $100,000 ideas.
So I have a really stupid question about like the neural network. So from what everyone's been talking about, it's games where the AI is being trained or learning how to play the game the same way as the player. Can this be applied to asymmetrical games where the AI has a different rule set or different abilities than the player? So like something like Slay the Spire would be a good example, where the different bosses, different characters, yes, they have cards or they have moves, but they're, it's essentially a completely different set of what the player can do.
I think you just want to have multiple neural networks. One neural network specialized for one side of the symmetry and one neural network specialized for another one. And as long as they train independently, and learn over the course of thousands and hundreds of thousands of games, I think theoretically it's very doable.
Although in the specific example you used with Slay the Spire is purely deterministic. It will always behave exactly the same given the same set of situations.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's the puzzle, right? It's the information is hidden, but it's static. And so you play with the rules of the game to explore that configuration. And once you've learned it, then you're the only uncertainty is the cards at your disposal, the state of your character, and whether you know their behavior well enough to, one, identify like, oh shoot, this is just going to suck, or if you have a valid solution at your disposal.
The counterinsurgency games, coin games, are very asymmetrical for the board game stuff. Stuff like Twilight Struggle or Labyrinth are out there right now, and they don't use neural nets. The AI is decent, but I can see that being applied to each of the sides, whether it be the terrorists or the Islamics or the I can't remember what the other side is called. It's jihadist and coalition, which play totally different. So there would need to be a completely different AI. It's almost different rules. Now they also have kind of a loose solo play type situation where you're going down a matrix and it's playing, and the opponent's taking the turns and doing the things based on a matrix. And that's an interesting concept. I mean, that's really just turning a heuristic. That's really just making a heuristic AI.
I mean, I think it is important to look at what is the AI trying to accomplish. Like in the Slay the Spire example, if it's a deterministic game, you're not going to get the value of the RNG variables that create that like nice big branching space that you get to explore with your neural network. So it might not make as much sense. And you might want to have the neural network for the player side, because the player is doing a deck builder and you are getting that RNG that you can take advantage of there. So I think that's the problem, is that right now I feel like AI design, especially with neural network stuff, feels kind of like it's alchemical stages where we're just kind of like making things up and we don't know. Like right now, there's no tool that just tells me here's what kind of AI I should be developing. I have to like be a personal expert on that. And I don't know what the structure of the neural network should be. And I don't know, how many hidden layers and how many input nodes, and, there aren't a lot of tools. It would be really cool in like 5 or 10 years to just plug in, what is this game? Okay, here's the kind of AI that like would best be optimized for this game.
And it's so going to happen. I mean, it seems it would be weird if it doesn't, I feel like.
I'm on board for that, yeah.
Another game that I played this year that was one of my favorites, I'm pretty sure 3 of you and probably most people watching this did not play, was Library of Runa, which is a deck building style RPG. And one of the things they did in that one was they kind of embraced the idea that the AI was never going to play by the same rules as the player. And to kind of like build that up, they just created like over 80 different unique fights or unique deck building battles. And they purposely designed the AI, or they designed the AI's abilities to have no real comparison with the player. Like, it was basically like you're just fighting 87 different puzzles against something trying to kill you. And in a way, I think it kind of played to that game's strengths, because it made it feel it had no near comparison to a Slay the Spire or Monster Train. It was very much a game that was about probably 50 minutes or like 67% planning, and then the rest of that percentage is on executing and hoping that you were able to outplay the tricks that the AI was going to throw against you. And I think that is a very fascinating idea. But again, it also kind of throws back this conversation of, would it have been better if the AI was just, trained to do the same things as the player? Or would it kind of hurt the mood or the actual feeling of what it meant to play that game?
The answer, like always, is that depends.
Yep.
I think the cost factor that has been beaten into my head of developing an AI like that in a game like Library of Runa would be an issue. So this kind of abstracts it. Panzer General did the same thing. I mean, the Panzer General AI, it's not great, but they built it as a puzzle. Once you figured out how to break through the lines and where to attack, you were golden. But the whole thing was built as a puzzle. And I think that's good. Other Side, I think, did something similar to that, with it being really asymmetric and the AI was not playing the same game you were. And it was very puzzle oriented with how you sacrificed and built your daughters.
But it's worth noting that puzzle designers, though, aren't thinking about a game that would be amenable for an AI to be effective, right? They're building this sort of configuration, information state that the player is just browsing. Really, it's just an exploration of some shape. There's like a drawing and most of it's hidden, and then playing the game you uncover the drawing. You're like, oh, that's a nice drawing.
So
yeah, it does feel like there's like this accidental puzzle play of like figuring out, especially with the heuristic AI, what are all the AI's kind of like patterns you figure out. I think it's really fun, to be honest, and I do think like that's like this emergent gameplay thing where I think some people would say, oh, in a pure world the AI would be like the most competent possible, but I feel like it's really something kind of fun about when you can figure out what does the AI happen to do and how can you evade it. It's like its own little meta game.
So you kind of like breaking games.
So there's this environment. The use case for my brain to try to like aspire to something more interesting is large scale ground warfare. It's only because I know it well. I'm sure there's many other good examples, but in the context of large scale ground warfare that covers a lot of territory, the people controlling the forces on either side have an enormous amount of space to explore. Like they could choose to do anything, and granted, what they choose to do very much has to be considering what the other side is doing. And so this like creates like an interesting environment, I feel like, for an AI, and then it leads to this really important point I think we want to make, is that the AI is there so that it can create a relationship with the player, right? It can operate according to your actual, like against your actual decisions. You feel like it's responding to you, uniquely to you, even if what it's doing is drawing from the totality of human knowledge to do so. It's the thing that's missing from the heuristic AIs, is that it feels like you're pushing buttons and it's turning on different lights in the machine. And once you know how the machine works, you're exploiting it. Whereas you could flip that around, is that I'm trying to just win, maybe take objectives, take hills, and cut off logistic lines of support and stuff. But then the enemy is responding to me. It's like it's trying to hit my buttons and pick me apart. And the moment that happens, something I think magical happens in our minds. Then I start questioning why I'm making choices. And now I kind of want to guess what it's thinking. And then I change what I do. And then this kind of like, oscillation curve starts occurring, where what matters is what I choose to do. Actually, what matters is whether I understand what it's doing. And then, oh my God, it understands what I'm doing. I need to change what I'm doing. But what is it thinking? Now I'm trapped in that loop. That loop is now running away, right? Like a flywheel, creating all this exciting engagement. And I feel large-scale land warfare, kind of in the context perhaps in something like War in the East or War in the East 2, is this use case for me, which we probably don't have enough time to get into too much detail about. But what are your thoughts, Theresa?
Oh gosh, I mean, well, that's just something I'm so far away from being an expert in. But my first reaction was just the Princess Bride scenario of like, wait, but if I think you put poison in that, but then I think you thought I was going to think you put poison in that. And it does actually remind me of, Race and Roll for the Galaxy, these role choosing games where at higher levels of play, you're not necessarily like trying to figure out what you should do. Your main goal is to try to predict what other people are going to do. So you could either exploit it, take advantage of it, or you can screw them over and gain a little bit of an advantage there. And, that is something that like the neural networks handle really well. But for war games, I feel like there is just part of that idea of the epicness of war is just there's so many agents. There's so many like people and units and stuff going on. And I think that degree of complexity right now, it could be a challenge for neural networks to run all of that complexity. What we're doing is more on the scale of like, are you playing this card or that card? Not like here's your 1,000 units and like run through all of it. And especially for something on mobile, which
I think that brings up an important point, though, right? That as we go forward in the timeline, I think we'll have we'll develop templates to train neural networks, like some layer in between that kind of organizes. I've had a lot of conversations about storytelling AIs, and a lot of the kind of the cutting edge stuff right now is just like good. It's just doing the brute force thing, right? It's combined all of the sports reporting of human history, put it into a giant bucket, and then is given some information. It spits out a very sound, sort of difficult to determine, was not written by a human, sort of quick story about a sports event. But if you wanted to create like the kinds of stories we like for entertainment, at the very least, that AI would have to know sort of a concrete rule set about connecting characters and their arcs to the important events of a story. And that in the context of brute force training it to get there, it might be, you know, too large an exponent of information to kind of get it to that point. So you kind of have to help it along with some structure. And I'm definitely interested to see. I feel like it's inevitable that we do that, right? Because inevitably people that are playing with AI are doing so, like you said, to kind of jump ahead, sort of, right? There's a sort of urgency in their design, and they don't have enough resources to brute force it, so they got to get more clever.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of military stuff, by the way, it would be then, you know, that there are strategies to select from, right? That there's organization and structure inside of the neural networks, whatever.
What is Epic Tavern doing on that front with the procedural generation stories? Is it engaging any type of heuristics or?
I mean, we have like a bunch of random selections and sizes of those selections and conditions for those selections, and then we just try to kind of emulate it. So we're just smoke and mirroring an AI that seems like it might have some subtlety to its selection. It's like, you know, like 1 out of 27 times it decides to go down this route of this uncommon result. And the other times it seems like it picks more conventional or meets expectation results. Oh, I get it. It feels like the game has like these curves where it wants to give me something normal most of the time, but occasionally this weird exception occurs. You know, it's all very heuristic driven. It's just where we offer randomness or uncertainty, we're trying to sculpt that to kind of create something that makes sense to humans, I guess.
So I have a question for the three of you on when we're talking about like presenting an AI that can kind of challenge or kind of adjust the flow of the story. Something that was always fascinating from when I played Left 4 Dead 1 and 2 was the idea of the AI director and having the AI be an actual, you know, the surrogate dungeon master. That it would not only dictate, you know, what items could appear, but would also understand what it can throw at the player. And my friends and I, we loved this idea, but it felt like it never really got to the level that we wanted to see. And this may again go back to the idea we were talking about earlier in terms of, you know, what the super high level players want may not be what the rest of the players want. And the issue that we ran into was we got so good at the game that the AI just felt like it was kind of shackled, that it didn't really get the chance to do anything that we didn't already know about. And I think part of that could have also been the linearity of the maps, which got, I think, even worse in Left 4 Dead 2. But it was just the fact that it felt like the AI just didn't have enough tools in its toolbox to adequately give that sense of it being a different experience. And another point could have also just been the fact that we just got so good at the game that, you know, we completely saw the man behind the curtain. Like, there was nothing the AI could have done at that point that we wouldn't already know, prepared, and could adapt for.
Well, is the AI, or the director, I think is what they called it, is that really the story, or is the story you going around and killing everything and just stomping it? I mean, RimWorld has a really good game director, and people love the game director. But at this point, everybody's good enough with RimWorld that, you know, okay, you get attacked by 50 hamsters and 2 of your people die. Big deal. We're going to recover. You know, how much the real story in RimWorld is what your colonists are doing and how they're reacting. Again, it's throwing speed bumps at you.
Yeah.
Well, you call it a speed bump, but I think what happens is that the developers thought that they were covering a decent range of difficulty, right? But since it's straight logic, once you exceed that, you're past its bounds, and we know that players that are committed, they are much better than the developers imagined.
Of course. And again, the modders of these games, they will go places that I don't think any developer will ever be able to fully compensate for.
Oh, if you only looked in the dark recesses of the internet for
Oh
Sims
no.
4 mods or
Oh dear.
RimWorld mods,
Or Skyrim
you'll find
mods.
some, wow, crazy stuff.
Skyrim is a really good anti-AI example, I feel like. It's a game that just about completely collapses from a functionality standpoint once you get deep enough into the game. And yet you still see like millions of players continue to play well past that point, right? And that is not a good selling point for totally sound balance at the very least, right? That said, I think that if once we temper the curve, if you could feel like you had a responsive opponent that would grow with you as you continue down the path, provided the game still has something to explore, I think would definitely find it. We're going to see examples, or there are already probably plenty, but we're going to see more and more examples of games that use AI to kind of draw me into ever deeper levels of kind of nuance in terms of my strategies and my effectiveness.
I kind of wonder, like, I think I got involved with gaming because of my love for the Morrowind and the Fallout series. And by the time I was playing Skyrim, I feel like it was so much easier, but I kind of had this like nostalgic love for like previous more challenging versions that I just kind of as a player kind of had this like trust that it would be harder, or like maybe a backlog of like love for the Bethesda team that there was just something that like it kind of didn't really matter that the AI wasn't as challenging. At some point it was like just this like nostalgia trip of like comfort.
Well, then do you feel like there's like this like ramp up where the difficulty is keeping up with you, right? And then there's a plateau where you just need to master the last set of things, but the game can't throw anything more at you. And then there's the collapse. And then in the collapse, somehow, before you lose interest, you're trying to fit in as much tourism as possible in the game systems. And then you're like, oh, I'm not interested anymore. You flame out and you go on to the next game.
It reminds me a lot of a phrase that Tom Chick coined, the Chick parabola. This was back, I think, during his, I want to say Civ 4, or I think it was Civ 4 review, where he talked about how the more he learned the game, the less fun and less interest he had in the game.
Yeah, certainly.
It is that interesting parallel because, again, it kind of cuts at what the audience wants. For people who really like strategies, who really like learning their systems, they want to play something that can push back and say, oh, you figured out you can do so this, and this. Well, guess what? I've already prepared a counter for it. Whereas some people, they want to do this, and this, and the game just goes, you have beaten me, you can now move on. Because I remember reading like those strategy guides for Oblivion Skyrim, where like you can just, I think one was like, if you just, create like the perfect stealth cape, that's it. Like the AI can't do anything. Or you can just go here, do this same task like 50 times, you've now maxed out stealth, or you've maxed out agility. That's it. Like, the AI can't do anything more around it.
Oh man, I had a thought there, but I got distracted by your comment about Oblivion Stealth because I did exactly that. I think though we need to fall back on a different rule about human experience. The moment there is no uncertainty in an experience, or at least I believe there is no uncertainty, I am done. My brain is no longer engaged. It has nothing left to farm from this activity. And so convincing a player that there's nothing left, or there are no more stones, or for it to be actually technically true, is a true closure for that game experience. And so if you can't reintroduce uncertainty, or if you can't create any questions or any new dark territory to shine light upon, there's no more game there.
And so then the question for me is, do you even need to have uncertainty, or do you just need to have the like suggestion that there might be uncertainty?
Oh, yeah, it's just my belief. It's just my belief in my head, right? If I let's say I know actually like 1% of the information, but I believe I know 100% of it, I'm still out.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And if I know 100% of the information, but I believe that there is more, I'm still in.
And I think that's one of the reasons why roguelike design or roguelike systems have become very popular over the past 10 years. Because you can create variants without needing it to be, heavy on the AI side or on the enemy side. Again, games like The Binding of Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, even stuff like Slay the Spire. That, like we said earlier, Slay the Spire, it's deterministic. The AI is going to do the same thing every turn, and that's how it's going to play. What's going to be different is what you can do every turn and what cards you get for every run. So there is always going to be that uncertainty because you're never going to have a run in Slay the Spire or in any roguelike that is 100% like another run that you did. It's why there are people who have spent thousands of hours in The Binding of Isaac. They know every boss, they know every room, but they don't know what items they're going to get. They don't know if this run they're going to get a spread shot, or if this run they're going to find no keys. And then what are you going to do? And it's essentially, I guess, a way of like taking the AI or taking the opponent out of the equation. You're essentially in a battle yourself at that point.
Yeah, they're very self-battled. It's a totally different type of strategy where you're dealing with the best way to mitigate actions based on what you have, and to and not enhance, but how to work with the cards that you're given or the relics that you're given. It's very much it's not really a battle against the slimes. It's not really a battle against the ascensions. Well, the ascensions add more things to mitigate and stuff like that, and make it harder. But it's not a true PvE experience.
And I think, again, like, there's still that healthy market for a very interesting PvE style game. Again, like the Left 4 Dead, World War Z, games where players want to feel like they are fighting against something, that they are trying to overcome some kind of obstacle that's presented to them. But again, it raises that question of how high do you make that hill or that mountainside? Do you make an AI that can, that knows every potential strategy? Or do you try and make something that, again, is more like... I always like, when I talk about horror games, it's the difference between, a horror movie like you are trapped in, Michael Myers' house, or are you more in a haunted house? Where, you walk by and all of a sudden you see like a plastic guy come out of the door and you can see like the strings that are going to pull him back in.
Didn't the industry try to do that for a little bit with the asymmetrical games where it's 3 or 4 of you against some evolving creature? I think like maybe Hunt, and there was...
there was the game Evolve. What was that?
Evolve, yeah, that's it.
Friday the 13th is a naked version of the exact thing you said.
Yeah, and Dead by Daylight, of course, as well. But with like Dead by Daylight's example, there's no AI in that game. Or the AI is so simple. I think this gets at another point that I want to ask everyone about. That we talked earlier about having a strong or a competent AI in a PvP or competitive style game as a means of training or practice. But one of the things I see that happens in a lot of these cases is that playing against AI has very little relation to playing against a real player. Like, StarCraft being a good example. I played the StarCraft 2 campaign, I played the original campaign, I thought, okay, I can maybe try playing against another player. No. They stomped me into the ground faster than I think someone could put out like a little campfire. The same...
I think that's going to be related to the style of AI. If it's the heuristic one, you're going to figure out the exploits and you're going to feel pretty good about yourself, and then the other people are not going to be vulnerable to them. But if the AI is neural network, I don't think it's quite as vulnerable to that.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like, it's a very weird case that I really liked Rise of Nations, and even what was it? And even when I try to play the comp stomps in Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, that it felt like what the AI was throwing at me is very much in line with what an actual player could throw at me. And again, I think it also has to do with like the different moods. Like what they did with StarCraft 2's campaign, for instance, was Blizzard just basically said, we're not going to touch competitive multiplayer with a single player. Like, they gave you crazy abilities, they made all the missions one-offs, and they basically just said, okay, here's single player, here's multiplayer, and these two will never interact with each other. But the positive of that, again, is that you have two distinct flavors of that game. But the negative is that if somebody's trying to cross over from one side to the other, there's no real, I think, path for either way.
Well, I mean, I think we need to, like, I don't think it's fair. Like, first of all, games do not need an AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to think about AI as a tool for adding engagement that is difficult to do in other circumstances. I think that's this whole idea of the AI kind of having a relationship with you and directly responding to you as it gets more refined, and it acting like another human, I think, is important. But more importantly is that it gives you the experience that the game is responding to your actions, and that what you've done is sort of kind of the thing that's creating this experience. And that even if that other players had played the game, that they felt that they had their own experience as well. This imagination that something alive is responding to me, I think goes a long way to potentially adding a lot of at least more engagement to the existing single player experiences, depending on what they are. And that's not to say there's plenty of types of games that aren't broken, don't need fixing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point there, because I mean, we look at like action-based games or some like the more like modern retro games where the AI is just, again, a fixed pattern. Like, you don't need a neural network for Bowser to fight Mario in the original Mario Brothers. It comes down to, again, like what you're trying to kind of get out of the game, or what is the role of the gameplay itself.
Yeah, what has the developer chosen as the experience? And
Mm-hmm.
many experiences, like, generally speaking, poetry does not need any variation.
Mm-hmm.
All the uncertainty is on the side of the user. Which, by the way, action, like timing-based activities, that's a way to kind of introduce a certain amount of uncertainty, right? It's that I know I need to hit the button at this point, but it's hard, so I have to keep trying. And then you put me under more pressure, and it's like, my percent chance of failure just went up again. I can keep trying.
Here's a kind of weird tangent, but I'm not sure if anyone has the answer to this. But with the rise of Souls-likes, specifically with like the From Software enemy designs and boss designs, do they use a deterministic AI or a neural net for kind of like how the AI picks what attacks it will do? Because in those games, AI is pretty much designed that it will kind of passively read where the player is, and in terms of what it will actually throw at them. So you're never 100% sure what the AI is going to do at any given attack.
I think it's randomization of patterns and heuristics. I don't think they're using any type of learning system.
Okay.
It's just, analyzing what the player is doing and then coming up with a list of counters and choosing one.
In general, I don't think that there's a lot of learning AI in use in like shipping games right now. Like there's, viticulture and some of the digitized strategy games that Tyson Streep has worked on, and then there's like Alpha StarCraft, kind of researchy project.
Yeah.
But most of them are heuristic at this point.
I wanted to back up, if we could, to StarCraft and Alpha Star. That is a wonderful enhancement to the whole neural network based off of TD Gammon. This thing is competing at levels that shouldn't be possible by a computer, and you're using constraints to make it so it has to see the map. It doesn't have any advantage, and they slow down so it has a reasonable actions per minute. Because the computer can send, it's not reflex based, so they tune it so that it's whatever the top is, and it's competing at levels of what was it, 99.8% of the players it can beat.
Well,
That has a really interesting effect.
I don't think that's very surprising, though, right?
Better. What was that?
That's not very surprising, though, is it?
StarCraft is a pretty dynamic game.
It's a big technical achievement. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot to process there, and getting it performant and having it compete against top players. I mean, I think that's a pretty big benchmark for AI. I mean,
Well, I just mean that players actually have a rather difficult barrier to overcome. That once there is any kind of neural network like behavior in action, that's going to very rapidly make all other human players at a severe disadvantage because it can just start doing it right. And the very best players, their mistake rate is quite low. Their ability to kind of pack a lot of activities and choices into a short time frame is well trained, but they're going to start butting up against the limitations of the hardware that the AI is not going to run into.
Well, I mean, the AI is totally going to run into the limitations of the hardware. That is the main limiter right now. Like it is.
I just mean my response time is actually is so much larger than the potential for the computers is all.
Yeah.
One thing I would love to see, like, this discussion about trying to make an AI or create the AI that can really challenge a player in interesting ways. I would love to see somebody kind of experiment with. Is he kind of, I'm not sure we have an actual like subgenre name for it yet, but the kind of, defend the base kind of game. Stuff like They Are Billions, Age of Darkness, that Conan game that came, I think, like 2 years ago. Like
Conan Unchained, I think?
Yeah.
No, that was MMO, wasn't it?
It was one of them. I'm not sure. Age of Conan was the MMO.
MMO, yeah.
Conan Unconquered was it. And I think like that could be another spot that could be very fascinating because again, like those games are very much about I am trying to, build the perfect strategy. Can something, topple my fort? And having the AI that can actually learn and, adequately figure out, what is my weakness, I think could make that very fascinating. As opposed to just saying, I'm just going to throw 10,000 guys at you and, will it work? Will it won't? Who cares?
There's one in development right now that I'd like to call a combination of Carcassonne, a card game, and a tower defense game. It's called Orcs. And it's supposedly, and I've only played the demo of it, but it will analyze where your weak spots are and attack from those directions.
I've played very little of that game, and I was horrible at it, so I'll have to give it another try.
There were some
I think a new version just came out recently.
Ooh, yay! If you built half of a castle or something, they would swarm to it. So you would have like these castle pieces all over the place as an exploit. I think not Age of Darkness. Yeah, it is Age of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that does a little bit of scanning too. I think those are considered base builders and tower defense type things. I mean, There Are Billions just tries to overrun you.
Yeah.
Good job of it.
How do you spell orcs again? So I'm trying to look it up to see what's going on with it.
Is this Orcs Must Die?
No, ORX.
Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong game.
Orcs Must Die is nice, though.
There.
And it is a base defense sort of game.
Yeah.
Well.
You must just be really familiar with it. It's just Orcs now.
As a quick time check, we are about an hour and 20 into the conversation. Is everyone go with maybe starting to wrap things up, or are there any other major topics you want to present?
I wanted to bring up something real quick, and make sure that that this is kind of put in the show notes and stuff. Let me pull it up. Tom Lenham, Race for the Galaxy, did an excellent GDC talk about designing games. That if you're into board game design, if you're into type game design, this talk is amazing, and you can find it on YouTube. All the GDC stuff is worth looking into if you're into design, but this really stands out.
What was that guy's name again?
Tom Lehman, and I'll put the link in the chat so we can link the GDC talk. Because it is a perfect example of really, really tight design that can be and had been able to be enhanced with this Sheldon Jones AI. I'm a fanboy.
Very cool. No, I mean, it's almost certain, right, that the amount of kind of logic burden that developers are starting to face, it is not, the solution is not to get better at handling that fragile complexity. I mean, AI is going to start to take over more and more percentage of our share of problem solving as time goes forward.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah. One thing that I think it's too big, but we do a part 2 I would like to talk about, is the idea of AI when it comes to helping the player, having bots, and how far you want to balance and design them around. Because I've seen, especially with a lot of action-based games, the problem being that the developers have a struggle of how competent do they want to make the AI? Is it good enough to, beat the whole game themselves? Or in some cases, like when I played Back 4 Blood, where all 3 party members are down, the AI is not coming to help anyone. It's just standing there shooting. We're just yeah, we're screwed here, aren't we?
Honestly, when you're working along that path, I think that you're missing the target. The target should be cooperative AI elements that convince me that they're who they are, or that they're interesting kind of compliments to my team, or that they make mistakes in charming ways, and they kick ass in the ways that they're supposed to. Sort of like the implications around storytelling AI. It's that so many of the objectives that we're optimizing for, they might just be a little bit misplaced. And once we start optimizing for the right thing, we'll get better results out of the way humans respond to them.
I mean, for me, I just care if there's collision as long as they don't path in my way.
Right. Does anyone else have any final points, any final topics they would like to say? If not, we can start to wrap things up.
How do we make this technology more pervasive in the industry?
Say that again, because I cut you off.
How do we make this technology more pervasive in the industry? How do we convince the industry to move in this direction of challenging AI or neural networks and such?
We can vote with our dollars. I mean, as players, as I'm assuming we're all also just like big strategy players. We can vote with our dollars and hope our friends do the same and reward teams that are doing this. Sounds a little self-centered or self-interested, but
my answer is just wait until you either it becomes 10% as hard to implement, or 10 times faster and or less resource intensive. Any of those things is inevitable, and then adoption will start to skyrocket. Right? We're before the hockey stick moment for implementation of neural networks.
Yeah.
And again, I am not a programmer by any means, so I don't really have too much I can add that the three of you haven't already said, but definitely a fascinating conversation.
No, this was a ton of fun, and the only thing I wanted to say was I can't wait for games to be able to interact with me in ways that the developers really never thought about, but the developers put the right constraints in place so that there was a really interesting and rich space for me to kind of basically dance with a decision-making algorithm, I guess. And so I think that, and I also think it's inevitable, so it's really exciting.
Tomo, I'd suggest to you the game Flashpoint, Red Storm, I believe it is. It's an interesting take on battlefield conditions for the Cold War, where communications to get orders through is simulated by the time frame. It pushes back at you in some really interesting ways. They're doing a new one. I don't recall the name, but the old one is still very solid.
Definitely one of the part twos to this conversation. We could start picking apart the role of AI behavior in the context of turn-based and hexes and all of, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's a bit too dry to get into the history of all the efforts that developers have made to make that an interesting environment to play. But I definitely have a lot of thoughts. I'll check the game out for sure. Thank you, Seth.
All right. So before we end things for tonight, as always for these roundtables, I will give everyone a chance to plug and promote anything that they are doing. So once again, we'll start with Theresa and work our way around.
Sure. If anyone would like to jump into the Dominion beta, please come to templegatesgames.com/beta. And if you would like to generally find out when there's going to be a new expansion drop for the other game that we make that you play, you can sign up for templegatesgames.com/newsletter, and we'll announce it there.
All right. And to Seth?
Can I bug you to give me some information later on Shards of Infinity expansion?
You can bug me.
That's what I'm working on. I'm working on getting Temple Gates to give me a Shards of Infinity. No, I'm Seth. What I'm doing right now is we'll have links in the chat. Nothing, or not in the chat, in the show notes.
All right.
And the game Hyperkinetic Studios works on internally, called Epic Tavern. You can participate with all our discussions and updates through either our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Epic Tavern, or at our Discord channel, discord.gg/Epic Tavern.
All right. And for me, if you're watching this right now, then you probably know what Game Wisdom is. But if you don't, do all the liking and subscribing. I'm on Twitter at GW Bycer. And check out our Discord as well as my variety of books on design. The latest one, Horror, is out now. And I'm currently working on free-to-play and mobile design for book number 5. But that is going to do it for this roundtable. So I would thank everyone for participating, and yeah, we should definitely do a part 2 at some point in the future.
My thumbs are up. You can't see me. Yes.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
All right. So with that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games, and have a great rest of your night. Take care.